In a land where life is a thin ribbon along a river, unity is not a celebration. Unity is a problem. Because the moment Egypt becomes one, it inherits a question it can't outrun. Where does Egypt end? Not in poetry, not in myth, on the ground. The earliest Egypt was not one nation. It was two worlds stitched to the same river, a long southern corridor and a northern delta that spread like a fan into the sea. And then, suddenly, someone claims both. A name rises from the first stone shadows of history, Narmer. But Egypt's memory doesn't begin with a name. It begins with an image, two crowns, one face. This episode is not about a battle. It's about a trick, the trick that turns geography into obedience. There is a reason the Narmer palette still hits like a thunderclap. It isn't just an artifact, it's a message carved into permanence. On it, the king appears tied to both symbols, south and north, as if the stone itself is teaching the viewer how to see reality. Two lands are now one. But the palette also shows something more important than victory, a script of power. The king is larger than everyone else, the defeated are bound. Order stands upright, disorder collapses to the ground. Whether this reflects one campaign or many doesn't even matter, because what Egypt is building here is not a report. It's a reflex the state will repeat for millennia. The king stands, the world kneels, and once that image becomes normal, the next step becomes possible, a center that speaks for the whole river. A unified country cannot remain a chain of villages. It needs a throat, a place where decisions become orders, where grain becomes numbers, where distance becomes administration. So Egypt pulls itself toward a strategic hinge on the Nile, near the seam between the two lands, and builds power around it. Not a palace first, not a monument first, something quieter, standards for storage, standards for seals, standards for officials who speak in the king's name, because here is the real invention after unification: reach. When you unify, you don't just gain territory, you gain the ability to touch a village hundreds of kilometers away without being there. That is what a state is. Let me show you what that reach looked like. His name was Hezi-Ra, an elite official and master scribe in Djoser's world in the Memphite region, buried at Saqqara. Every morning Hezi-Ra woke before sunrise. He prepared his reed pen. He ground his ink, black from soot, red from ochre. He unrolled fresh papyrus. And then he did something more powerful than a weapon. He recorded grain deliveries, obligations, shortfalls, debts, from villages he would never visit, from farmers he would never meet, but his pen reached them. If a farmer in the Delta owed 20 baskets of barley and delivered 18, Hezi-Ra wrote 2 baskets short, and once it was written, it didn't vanish when the sun went down. The state was not soldiers knocking on doors, the state was ink on papyrus. And ink, unlike armies, doesn't get tired, it doesn't forget. Hezi-Ra was not alone. He belonged to a small class of scribes and administrators, limited in number, who could read and write. Estimates vary, but full literacy likely belonged to only a fraction of the population. That was enough, because once something is written, it becomes official. It becomes harder to deny, it becomes real, and that's the trick. You don't have to be everywhere if your records are. But reach creates fear, because the farther your reach extends, the more your edge becomes vulnerable. Now the story turns south, because if the north is spread and marshy, the south is narrow and sharp. The Nile tightens, navigation becomes choke points, the landscape becomes gates, and gates create obsession. Who controls passage? Who controls trade? Who controls what comes in and what leaves? Egypt's southern frontier was not empty. It faced Nubia, a world of its own, with power, wealth, and networks. Egypt called the borderland Ta-Seti, land of the bow, a name that tells you exactly what the state saw when it looked south. Archers, not peasants, not tourists. A frontier people who could fight. And suddenly, unification has consequences, because a king who unites must now patrol the edge of his new reality. Here's the paradox of early empire. Egypt's identity is built on the idea of the center, But the center can't survive without the border, because borders are where the world leaks in. Goods, people, threats, prestige, humiliation. Nubia was not just outside, it was a corridor, a route, a pressure point, and yes, sometimes a target. Early dynastic Egypt pushed into that southern world in different ways across time. Expeditions, raids, pressure on routes, control of choke points, not always occupation, but always a message. The river has an owner now, and if that message sounds familiar, it should, because this is what empires do. They turn geography into authority. Every empire is born twice, once when it unites, and again when it draws a border. Egypt had something else that made the border more than a line. It had a word that was more than geography, more than a poetic metaphor, Kemet. The black land, the fertile strip where the Nile leaves dark soil behind, and its opposite, Deshret, the red land, the desert, wide, burning, indifferent. This was not just dirt and sand, this was identity. To live inside Kemet was to live inside rhythm, flood, planting, harvest, inside routines that made life predictable. To step into Deshret was to step into exposure, uncertainty, the edge of what could not be controlled. Egypt did not just unify territory, it unified meaning. Inside Kemet, you were inside the story. Outside Kemet, in the official imagination, order was fragile and danger was close. And once meaning is unified, the border becomes moral. Inside is civilization. Outside is not just foreign. Outside is risky. This is where empires are born, not only in conquest, but in the moment a people decide their way of life is not just different, it is the standard. And everything beyond the border becomes less ordered, less safe, less real. Nubia is not a footnote to Egypt, it is a mirror. A region with its own prestige and complexity, societies with trade networks and elite culture long before later kingdoms rise. Nubia traded with Egypt. It negotiated, it resisted. And the borderlands held resources Egypt wanted, gold and other prestige goods that helped power reward loyalty and fund its institutions. So Egypt faced a contradiction that every empire eventually faces. The ideology imagines the edge as inferior, but the economy depends on the edge, a center that calls itself civilized while needing what it calls outside. During the first dynasty, the generations after Nama, Egyptian kings projected force southward in different ways across time, not always to occupy permanently, often to secure routes, control choke points, and remind the frontier what a unified state could mobilize. And archaeology suggests that the world to the south did not remain untouched by this pressure. Unification did not stop at the last rival in the delta. It kept moving, not always as occupation, often as pressure, as expeditions, as raids, because the moment you can unify, the moment you can mobilize, you start to treat the border as a lever. And Nubia becomes a lever that can enrich you or break you. Egypt had fertile soil, but fertile soil creates people, and people need structure. So the crown looks outward, to deserts, to coasts, to the south, because the south is not just outside, the south is access to corridors, to raw materials, to strategic choke points along the Nile itself. This is why the border becomes sacred, because if the border fails, Kemet stops being Kemet. It becomes a strip of land with no protection from what leaks in. And when your identity is built on the idea that you are the only island of order, the existence of powerful neighbors becomes unbearable. So Egypt does what all empires do, from ancient times to modern ones. It turns difference into ideology. It tells itself a story where the center is civilized and the edge is chaos. And then it uses that story to justify control. Not because the story is true in every detail, but because the story is useful. Egyptian kings repeat the same iconography for millennia, the ruler standing above the kneeling enemy, the foreigner bound, Victory rendered as ritual. Whether war is real in a given year or not, the image remains. That is not reporting, that is training. It teaches every generation the same reflex. Order is Egyptian, disorder is foreign. And if that reflex takes root, the state does not need soldiers on every street corner, because discipline becomes internal. The border becomes psychological. By the time Hesi-Ra sat down each morning to record deliveries and obligations, the system was mature. A center, a bureaucracy, a border, an identity. This was not Nama's doing alone. This was centuries of construction. Dynasty 1, Dynasty 2, pharaohs whose names blur, but whose administrators built something that outlasted them all. A machine that did not need constant violence, because it had something better, a shared story. And this is the key. Once a shared story holds, the state can attempt projects that would otherwise be impossible. So, what does a unified Egypt do first? Build upward or push outward? Most people think Egypt's story is pyramids, but pyramids come later. First comes a simpler, harsher reality. A state must prove it can hold. Hold the delta, hold the valley, hold the gates. Because once you claim two lands, you inherit two problems: distance and borders. Nama's greatest achievement wasn't a battle. It was the invention of a new normal. One crown can speak for the whole river, and once that normal is accepted, a new kind of project becomes possible. Projects that require a country, not a city. Projects that require coordination at scale. Projects that require the population to move as one body. Around 2650 BC, Pharaoh Djoser sat in the Memphite world and consulted his vizier, Imhotep. The machine could reach everywhere. The scribes could record everything. The borders could be pressured. Resources could be moved. And Imhotep proposed something that only a machine state could attempt, something no village could build. Hesi-Ra died around 2600 BC. He was buried at Saqqara, near the step pyramid of Djoser. Not because he was a conqueror, but because he belonged to the class that made conquest unnecessary. He left behind carved wooden panels showing the identity he wanted to carry into eternity. A man with a reed pen, a man defined by records. Because in Egypt, power was not only in the crown, power was in the ability to make something official, to turn obligation into ink, ink into truth, truth into routine, routine into obedience. Egypt discovered something fundamental. If you control the border, if you define who is inside and who is outside, you do not just control territory. You control identity itself. And identity, once established, can become stronger than any wall. Next time, why this new machine state chose to build something impossible. And what the first pyramid really was. Not a tomb, but a demonstration. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.